see an increase.
Movie time starts right now, on demand.
We're the best agents.
Upper 20s to low 30s. Then tomorrow, a mix of rain and snow. More snow than anything else because with a north wind, it's going to be colder. Highs only in the upper 30s, and a little rain may mix in, but mostly we're talking inch or two of snow. A little bit more in some places like northeastern South Dakota, southwest Minnesota. It's going to be breezy on Thursday as the system pulls away, mostly sunny, low to mid 40s. After that, Friday, April 1st, 50, maybe some sprinkles on Saturday. Temperatures mostly in the mid 50s. More chances for some rain showers Monday and Tuesday of next week.
Farmers learned all about
Ages.
Dakota News Now, sponsored by Montgomery's.
Fainting can also happen. Help protect what counts. Talk to your doctor or pharmacist about Gardasil 9.
Small Del Rio sector communities to ease the pressure. That includes the small city of Uvalde, where the mayor says he's fed up.
The last thing I need to be handling is an immigration issue that the federal government should be handling instead of dumping it on communities like ours.
And Brad.
One controversy that's enveloping one long-serving member of the court. Wall, there's news about how the court might change because the votes are reportedly falling into place to confirm a new justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson. In fact, she was back on the Hill today doing these Senate meetings. These are the private meetings separate from those big confirmation hearings we covered last week. The committee vote is set for next week. Then it would go to the full Senate. This would be a historic confirmation. It would be, as widely reported, the first black woman on the high court. In a moment, we're going to speak with the powerful Democratic senator who led the oversight hearings, the confirmation hearings for Jackson in the Supreme Court, and is also discussing all these issues, including accountability, potentially, for Justice Thomas.
Judge Jackson, you are extraordinary. Your story is a great American story. You are exceptionally qualified for this position. It raises a serious question about conflict of interest for Justice Thomas. The Supreme Court has not been cooperative. It's one of the few areas in our federal government that is not governed by an ethics code. I think that's long overdue.
The most powerful senator in Washington on these issues, Chairman Durbin, when we're back after this break.
Yes.
This cot is Irina Yashinovska's life now.
I work in Ukraine. I'm police. Yes.
You're a police officer?
Yes.
She was. She now grabs a neon vest instead. She's a volunteer at a Warsaw refugee center, where she herself arrived in early March, fleeing bombing in Kyiv. Most refugees leave here in days for temporary housing or for other countries. But it's been a month and she refuses to, unless it's to go home to her life in Kyiv, where her brothers are on the front lines.
Do you think you'll see them again?
No.
Yes, she says. They talk twice a week at most.
Я думаю, что все будет хорошо.
I think everything will be fine, she says. At least, I hope for it. Not just my brothers, but everyone. But life outside the war doesn't stop, even though Yulia Isayeva wishes it would. If I have to, she says, I'll do it. We'll start.
The extraordinary thing is, in talking to these refugees, they honestly believe that this temporary life that they're building is just that, temporary. They see the news images that you're playing on your show, Wolf. They hear the news. They explain this and digest it with their children, yet they still believe they're going to be able to go back to Ukraine, sometimes to destroy towns, and pick up where life paused. Wolf?
I certainly hope that happens. These are truly heartbreaking stories. Kyung-La in Warsaw for us. Thank you very, very much. Let's discuss what's going on with the UNICEF spokesman, James Elder. James, thanks so much for joining us. Tell us what conditions are like right now for Ukrainian refugees where you are. You're in Lviv. Tell us what they're like.
Look, Wolf, unfortunately, I mean, things are still vicious here in Ukraine. I wish I had better news. But, you know, just a few hours ago, just before curfew started, I was at the hospital here, the Children's Hospital, sitting with a young girl who'd been shot, you know, who had, in the last day or two, trying to get out of Kiev with her father, with her mother, shot in the leg. This young girl, Katya, her father shot in the hand. Luckily, they were rescued by Ukrainian medics, but she's not in a good way. As I left the hospital, went through a bunker because we had to go again, the air raid sirens and the stress, the strain, pregnant mums, children in wheelchairs in a bunker, mums breastfeeding, a good hospital above them, Wolf, but everyone far too terrified to be there because incredulously, you know, hospitals and medical centers seem to be continuously targeted in this country.
It's really, really so awful. These folks.
KELO's Bob Mercer has a closer look at that reinvestment payment program, and it's on the Capitol News Bureau page on our website now.
And let's get one last check for our weather with Jay.
All right, Tom, we got rain in central South Dakota. That's the greens. The blue up by Rapid City, the left-hand side of your screen, that is snow. A wintry mix making its way west to east across the region. We'll have kind of a sloppy mess tomorrow. Inch or two of snow most places like Sioux Falls, but a north wind 20 to 40 miles an hour, a cool, raw day.
That's it for us.
Have a great evening, everyone.
Tonight is their progress toward peace, the first meaningful negotiations between Russia and Ukraine since the war began. The demands that were made and why the Pentagon is saying not so fast. After more than a month of Putin's war, the new serious peace talks. Tonight, the promises made by the Russians and the skepticism from the West.
We'll see if they follow through on what they're suggesting.
Plus, could Zelenskyy soon meet with Putin in person? We have all the details. Helping the resistance, the female veterans and American nonprofit working with the U.S. military to get helmets and gear from Virginia to Ukraine. The new questions tonight after a CBS News Washington Post investigation reveals a 7-hour and 37-minute gap in White House call records during the Capitol Hill riot. Why Congress is now investigating a possible Trump cover-up. Severe weather risk, the damaging wind, tornadoes, and hail threatening the South. Another COVID shot. The FDA authorizes a second booster for those 50 and up, but could you have to pay for this dose? Plus, today's other top headlines. Will Smith apologizes, and Jada Pinkett Smith breaks her silence. What we're learning about that fatal fall at an Orlando amusement park. And the Queen's first public appearance in 5 months. Finally, we end tonight with the true meaning of friendship, demonstrated by 2 Georgia teenagers.
This is the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell, reporting from the nation's capital.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us on this Tuesday night. Tonight, the president and his top national security advisors are skeptical that a Russian pledge to scale back could mean that the war in Ukraine may be a step closer to being over. But there was a positive development today as negotiators from Russia and Ukraine met in Turkey today for a day of peace talks aimed at ending Russia's deadly invasion. In an address tonight, Zelenskyy said the talks were positive, but that doesn't drown out the sound of Russian attacks. The Russian negotiator raised the possibility of a meeting between President Zelenskyy and Putin that could occur after a draft agreement was ready. And there's this new development tonight in the effort to target Russian oligarchs. We're learning tonight that the British seized their first super yacht, a $50 million ship. So we've got a lot of news to get to tonight, but first, let's go to CBS's Deborah Pata in Kyiv. Good evening, Deborah.
Good evening. The Pentagon confirms there has been some movement by a small number of Russian forces pulling back from Kyiv, but it's calling this a repositioning, not a retreat, and the indiscriminate shelling of cities to the south and east continues.
This may be the first real sign of progress But it certainly falls short of a ceasefire so desperately needed. Russian negotiator Vladimir Medinsky said Ukraine's proposal to remain neutral by not joining any military alliance would be put to President Putin. But it's early days, and there's skepticism in the U.S.
We'll see if they follow through on what they're suggesting.
Boardroom negotiations far away from the battlefield have yet to make any difference for Ukrainians enduring the mounting horrors of this war. The port city of Mariupol has all but collapsed. An apocalyptic scene of rubble, twisted metal, and the disfigured outlines of the homes where people once lived. What else can I do? Gennady asks. There's nothing left for me here. He's walking away after nearly 40 years working as a shoemaker in Mariupol. Nearby in Mykolaiv, a Russian rocket ripped through a government building, leaving a gaping hole and fresh trauma. This woman watched helplessly as her colleague died in her arms. If Russia follows through on its announcement to drastically scale back operations near Kyiv and Chernihiv, it will bring desperately needed relief. Chernihiv has been pounded by the Russians, who now completely encircle the city, cutting off up to 130,000 people from water, electricity and food. In Kyiv, where residents have grown used to the regular sound of shelling and sirens, the prayer for peace has never been more urgent.
The Pentagon points out that the threat to Kyiv is not over, as they can still inflict massive brutality. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy also stressed that Russia can continue to attack his country, which is why he is not reducing their defense. Nora?
Deborah Pata, thank you. Well, at the heart of that Ukrainian resistance are the private citizens putting their lives on the line. And a group in Virginia is trying to help. Spirit of America is the only nonprofit that is officially approved by Congress and the Defense Department to work alongside deployed U.S. troops and provide private assistance in support of their missions. Well, we followed their shipment of much-needed equipment. Just over a month ago, the daily uniform for these Ukrainians was street clothes or a business suit.
What we have here is a really nice modern helmet.
But now they are soldiers. Soldiers for a volunteer army desperately in need of gear.
Thank you.
Enter Spirit of America, a nonprofit that works hand in hand with the U.S. military to provide non-lethal aid to military partners.
And has the pace picked up in terms of sending supplies in?
Absolutely. We met Colleen Denny and Terrell Chandler in Poland, where they're helping coordinate the aid.
How much is this gear needed?
Endlessly. The needs are endless. It's thousands and thousands of people that are asking. All the civilians that have joined the fighting, you know, become soldiers overnight.
What's the #1 need for Ukrainians?
Body armor and helmets is the thing that keeps getting identified.
We see the photos of the 18-year-olds who have their skateboarding knee pads and elbow pads on, and they're volunteering to go.
We'll hand the helmets to the tall people.
Much of the gear is stored here in a Virginia Beach warehouse. First aid kits.
This is for any chest wounds.
Protective body armor and other items are packed up and sent to Poland, filling every seat of this 767.
You will probably not find anybody else where an aircraft leaves the United States and the warriors have that equipment on their body in the same day.
Founded in 2003, Spirit of America has worked in more than 90 countries. Everyone on the field team is a veteran.
2 veterans. You guys never stop fighting, never stop serving.
This is our way to support those who are still wearing the uniform. So even though we're no longer in uniform, we can still support those who are.
And as of this week, Spirit of America has helped outfit more than 3,200 soldiers. And get this, a second plane leaves New York City tonight for the region. Their assistance is worth $7.2 million. Well, back here in Washington, we have some new details in the investigation into the January 6th assault on the Capitol. CBS News and the Washington Post have obtained White House records of President Trump's activities on that day, and they reveal a more than 7.5-hour gap in his call logs. CBS's Robert Costa has more of his exclusive reporting.
As chaos engulfed the Capitol building on January 6th, President Trump spoke repeatedly on the phone with allies and supporters. some urging him to put an end to the violence. But none of those calls are reflected in the 11 pages of White House records for January 6 given to the House Select Committee. There is a massive 7-hour and 37-minute gap in calls from 11:17 a.m. to 6:54 p.m., which includes the most violent period of the attack. Congressman Jamie Raskin is a member of the House January 6 committee.
Are you frustrated, Congressman, about the gaps in the record?
Yeah, I'm a little puzzled by the gaps in the record. I'm determined to close those gaps.
CBS News has confirmed at least 2 calls during the attack that do not appear on the phone log or the daily diary. One call from Trump to Utah Republican Mike Lee, and another call to Trump from House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, who described it to Norah O'Donnell by phone at the time.
I've spoken to the president. I asked him to talk to the nation to tell him to stop this.
The January 6 committee is now investigating whether the president and top aides used so-called burner or disposable phones to avoid scrutiny of their calls during that time.
It's almost like they didn't want this out there. And so we need to get to the bottom of this.
The logs do show several calls on the morning of the 6th, including from Rudy Giuliani and former President Trump's chief strategist, Steve Bannon. At 8:37 a.m., Trump spoke with Bannon, who sources say told him to call Vice President Mike Pence and urge him to block certification of the election. Trump later did phone Pence, failing to persuade him, but that call is not noted in the records. There is a listing at 11:17 a.m. The president talked on a phone call to an unidentified person. CBS News has learned the Pence call was in that time frame. There's also a lengthy gap during the attack, as recorded in Mr. Trump's daily diary. At 1:21 p.m., the president met with his valet, which signals a return to the Oval Office. The mob breached the Capitol just after 2 p.m., and the next entry isn't until 4:03, when Mr. Trump went to the Rose Garden to record a video for supporters.
We have to have peace. So go home. We love you. You're very special.
The phone logs pick up again that night when Mr. Trump had at least 11 calls between 6:54 and 11:41 p.m.
And Robert joins us now. All right, burner phones. I mean, what is President Trump saying about all this?
His spokesperson told us he had nothing to do with the records. Trump himself told us he doesn't even know about the phrase burner phones, have never used burner phones. But that statement's been called into dispute today by John Bolton, his former national security advisor, who told us Trump behind the scenes used that phrase many times in conversation.
It's just extraordinary. And so is the committee looking at this use of burner phones and what they were doing inside the White House?
7 hours and 37 minutes. They don't know who Trump was calling. This is part of the puzzle they're trying to piece together as quickly as possible. The midterms are looming. They're on a tight time frame.
All right, Robert Costa, thank you so much. Let's turn now to the weather, because another spring storm system is moving across the South tonight.
Of millions following a joke aimed at Jada Pinkett Smith, who shaved her head last July after a years-long public battle with hair loss. It's unclear if Rock knew about her condition.
Jada, I love you. G.I. Jane 2, can't wait to see it, all right?
After the slap, Smith then yelling to Rock.
Keep my wife's name out your mouth!
In his apology, Smith saying, "Jokes at my expense are part of the job, but a joke about Jada's medical condition was too much for me to bear, and I reacted emotionally." Overnight, Smith's mother telling our station, WPVI in Philadelphia, the onstage violence surprised her and was uncharacteristic of her son.
That's the first time I've ever seen him go off. I've never seen him do that.
And now, David, everyone waiting to see if the Academy will sanction Will Smith. This as Chris Rock is getting ready to take the stage again tomorrow night in Boston. David, it's in front of a sold-out crowd, and a lot of people wondering if that's when he addresses the incident.
Kena Whitworth tonight from California. Next tonight, 75 million Americans under the threat of severe storms from Texas to Iowa, heading into the night and tomorrow as well. A level 4 out of 5 potential for dangerous tornadoes, according to our team, and damaging winds, including in several states pummeled just a week ago. This all then moves east. Chief Meteorologist Ginger Z is in the storm zone tonight, where they are bracing for these storms. She's in Jackson, Mississippi tonight. Hey, Ginger.
And David, most of those surveys are completed from last week, nearly 70 tornadoes, and here we are again in the target zone. So let's go ahead and dive into the maps. Already erupting in severe thunderstorm watches from eastern Nebraska, western Iowa, Missouri, Kansas City's included, and eastern Kansas. But watch that area tonight that goes all the way down to Waco slide east. It'll cross this line of really severe storms that could have 70, 80-mile-per-hour gusts with it, crosses the Mississippi River around 2-3 p.m., gets to Jackson here in the later afternoon, and then moves into Alabama as well. Western Tennessee could even see some of these really strong straight line winds, but embedded in that line, David, we could see tornadoes. We will be covering it the whole time.
And we'll be watching you first thing in the morning, Ginger. Thank you. We turn now to the House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol. That committee now uncovering more about the gap in the White House phone logs on January 6th, that there was a 7-hour, 37-minute gap in the log. And who were the last people to talk with former President Trump before the log stops? Here's our chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl, tonight.
The January 6th committee is looking into an hours-long gap in the official White House logs of Donald Trump's phone calls on the day his supporters attacked the Capitol. The Washington Post and CBS are now reporting that gap was 7 hours and 37 minutes. 7 hours and 37 minutes without any record of the president's calls. The logs do show several calls earlier that morning before the riot began, including one from Steve Bannon. The day before, Bannon had fired up Trump's supporters on his podcast.
All hell is going to break loose tomorrow.
Bannon told them, "This is your time in history."
And all I can say is strap in. You have made this happen, and tomorrow it's game day.
On the morning of January 6th, the president also spoke twice to his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, who addressed the rally hours later.
Let's have trial by combat.
The January 6th committee is now preparing to hold a series of primetime public hearings likely to begin in May.
If we don't stand for our freedom and our republic, we will lose them.
Despite the gap in the records, Trump has long been known to have several calls while the attack on the Capitol was underway, including with House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy. The reason for the gap in the records is not entirely clear, but when he was president, Trump frequently used a private cell phone, his own personal cell phone, and he also took calls frequently from the phones of his top aides. David?
Which, of course, explains why it doesn't end up on the log. John Karl tonight. John, thank you. We turn now to the historic event at the White House today. President Biden signing a law making lynching a federal hate crime for the first time after more than 200 attempts by Congress. The new law named for Emmett Till, killed by a mob in 1955. Till's family seeing this law through. They have waited for so long. ABC's Rachel Scott tonight with their reaction.
Tonight, a historical moment more than 100 years in the making. President Biden signing the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act into law. Lynching, now a federal hate crime.
Lynching was pure terror to enforce the lie that not everyone belongs in America, not everyone is created equal.
To this day, it's still unknown just how many people have been lynched. Over 4,000 have been documented, including 14-year-old Emmett Till, brutally beaten and shot in Mississippi in 1955, accused of whistling at a white woman. His cousin Ollie Gordon lived with his family in Chicago. She told me this day would be full of emotion.
I would think about Emmett. I would think about his mother and the many, many other mothers that have to endure such pain because of hate.
Over the years, this legislation failed more than 200 times. Today, in the Rose Garden of the White House, Gordon standing behind the president, a witness to the history her family fought decades for.
I mean, we look at a day like this all these years later, and finally, we have an anti-lynching bill. It bears the name of Emmett.
Those who are convicted can face up to 30 years in prison. Today, the president acknowledging recent hate crimes, saying this is not just about the past, it's about the present and the future. David?
Till's family never giving up in their fight for this. Rachel, thank you. And we should point out that Rachel will have much more with Emmett Till's family, this long journey, this long fight for this new law in his name. That's later tonight, right here on Nightline. In the meantime, overseas tonight, and we're learning more about the terror in Tel Aviv, a deadly assault in a suburb of Tel Aviv, the third attack in Israel in a week. Amateur video shown on Israeli TV showing a man dressed in black carrying an assault rifle shooting at people on a street. 5 people were fatally shot before police arrived. Police then killed the attacker. An Israeli police officer was among those who died. The gunman reportedly a Palestinian from the West Bank. When we come back here tonight, the image of Queen Elizabeth tonight making news on several fronts, and the big change here at home for the NFL.
I'd like to invite you to Jersey Mike.
We had a mutual love of fishing and salmon.
He said he can have a conversation with President Putin about Donetsk and Luhansk in the east. So he's not given up, and he said he's going to have to consult with the Ukrainian people. He's going to have to go to a referendum on these things. So he's given some real thought, some serious thought, to what would go into this treaty, this agreement.
Understood. Ambassador Taylor, we always appreciate your insights, your humanity, as we think through the road through this war. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ari.
Appreciate it. We're going to fit a break. When we come back, President Biden marking the Emmett Till lynching. 67 years later, there is action. We'll explain when we return.
Variety.
You're like, really, Mommy? Really? You're going to be away from me?
Staying on the front lines with this struggle comes at a huge personal cost, but Lesia has no doubts.
I am where I have to be. I mean, things happen for a reason. I'm a firm believer in that. There's a reason why I was elected in 2019. We have a task, we have a duty, and we will complete it, and then we will see where life takes us.
Christiane Amanpour, CNN, Kyiv.
Thank you, Christiane. Just ahead, a new green light for many older Americans to get a second COVID booster shot, and growing fallout over Will Smith's now infamous Oscar slap.
Progressive era buildings, untouched.
Behind her and move on. She will find a way to share her pain on Red Table Talk and hold everyone's hand. Tears will be shed. We will fall into it because this is what we do. We all know that voters have a missing opportunity.
I feel like that. You sound like you say as if it's going to be insincere. I mean, she was.
I don't doubt that they want this to be a successful apology. I'm not negating, like Adrian said earlier, I won't purport to know what they're thinking. Right. But what I will say is this, they will not miss an opportunity to put this on Red Table Talk. I think that we know this is going to happen.
Of course, Adrian.
Can I say something? I think that there are people watching who are trying to play back what happened in their mind, because we're seeing this video of him being slapped, Chris Rock being slapped on a loop. And it's like kind of watching a bad movie where you want to pretend that it could end differently. And I would think that there are some people watching even our conversation at home thinking, how could this have stopped? Well, security didn't jump on the stage. Yeah. There are some people who think that the only person in that room who was empowered to prevent this was Jada. Because a man who would get up on the night of his life, on the night of his career, and go to, again, by his own admission, defend his bride from being personally harassed or harangued by a comedian, she could have reached out. Again, I think this is something that people
I feel like now we're putting the onus on Jada as if she's taking responsibility for it.
We're not doing anything. I'm telling you, when I think about these things, I'm thinking, what are people at home imagining?
Right. And he made a split-second decision. She can't read his mind. She can't read his mind and stop him.
No, but she knows him better than anybody else. And she is a wife, and she is watching.
Well, she did not go to console him after it happened, wasn't it? Denzel, Bradley.
No, they went to a party. But I think what happens is, too, I think the eye rolling told the story, and I think it was a trigger for a lot of Black women, because of course we've been told since we were little girls that our hair is ugly, that it's shameful, that it's something wrong with our hair. So for her to have to publicly, I mean, and this has been a public conversation that she's had about alopecia. I think we all know someone that deals with this, and we know, I mean, our crown is everything. Let me just throw mine around. But it's
throw that crown around, Darlene.
We identify by that. So it was triggering for a lot of women. So could, in that moment, Jada have looked at her husband and said, honey, that hurts. Don't do, I mean, stop what you're doing. Don't go up there and defend me.
But I don't even know if she had time for that. All right, obviously a lot more to talk about this. We will continue the discussion, have some final thoughts.
Don't use if you're allergic to Otezla. It may cause severe diarrhea, nausea, or vomit.
And delete.
We're trying to get them help and benefits that they deserve because they've waited a long time for that recognition, and so that's what we're all about here today.
President Trump signed the Vietnam War Veterans Recognition Act into law in 2017, designating every March 29th as National Vietnam War Veterans Day. An interesting night of weather, you could say, is ahead for a lot of us. Tyler Roney back with the final forecast right after.
Drier and healthier, so every touch will protect, like the
Harry and Meghan, who stayed in California. Prince Harry was there during last year's private funeral for Prince Philip, the Queen famously sitting alone because of the pandemic. And tonight, the UK seizing its first super yacht owned by a Russian oligarch. The $50 million yacht docked in London. Authorities say the Russian owner has close ties to Vladimir Putin. Its ownership deliberately hidden. The 192-foot yacht includes a penthouse, a swimming pool, and a wine cellar. When we come back here tonight, that powerful moment in Ukraine, the concert in the subway shelter.
From Nano Hearing Aids. Don't waste thousands.
President Biden's talk about how Vladimir Putin should not remain in power. We've been back and forth over this for the past few days, but there are other mixed messages coming out from the president on a number of fronts. Here's one of them about troops.
We're talking about helping train the troops that are the Ukrainian troops that are in Poland.
I do not believe that we are in the process of currently training military forces from Ukraine and Poland. There are liaisons that are there that are being given advice, and that's different than I think you're referring to with respect to training.
And they've had White House officials come out and trying to walk back and then de-walk back the walk back. Amy, it's been interesting to watch.
Well, it's been a tightrope in part because, look, every interaction with Russia has to be met with the reality that the person that is in charge of this, Putin, is obviously not somebody who is going to operate in good faith and is not someone that can be trusted. I agree with Mark that this idea that they are pulling back or pulling out is met with skepticism, in part because we know the history of Putin's time in power, where he has said, well, it's either a ceasefire or using the opportunity of a ceasefire to actually regroup and then retaliate. But I think for the president, look, he is looking also at where American voters are right now. And this is what Americans are saying is sort of similar to this sort of back and forth here, saying, like Mark, we want to see more done to help the Ukrainians. We want to see more done to hurt Putin. At the same time, we don't want to do something that could risk us going into war. We don't want to send American troops. We're happy to take more Ukrainian refugees, but we also don't want to find ourselves in Europe in a land war. And that is as I said, this tightrope and this tension that I think is going to be here as long as this fighting continues in Ukraine.
Yeah, and as this continues, there is a kind of reanalysis about defense spending and what that means in the U.S. Here are two Republicans looking at the budget saying,
"They'll get some help from Fidelity to envision what's possible."
Your room and delivery.
Fallout from the slap that stunned the world. Top officials in the Motion Picture Academy are getting ready to meet to consider taking action against Will Smith. Our Brian Todd is working the story for us. Brian, what are you learning?
Well, Wolf, the fallout is considerable tonight and widespread. Major Hollywood players are weighing in, and the key question looms: just how will the Academy hold Will Smith accountable? Tonight, growing questions about whether star actor Will Smith will be disciplined for this moment at the Oscars.
That was a nice one. Okay. I'm out here. Uh-oh, Richard. Oh, wow. Wow.
Two sources with knowledge of the situation tell CNN the Board of Governors of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences will meet tomorrow. Its main priority, discussing possible action and consequences for Smith for slapping comedian Chris Rock. An uncensored Japanese feed shows Smith's response.
Will Smith just smacked the shit out of me.
Will Smith にやられました。
Get my name out your mouth. Wow, dude. Yeah. It was a G.I. Jane joke. Keep my wife's
G.I. Jane のジョークだったんです。
Among the members of the Academy's Board of Governors, comedian Whoopi Goldberg and
their art director saying music can unite and that it's important now for those who stay in Kharkiv to be united. The resilience of the Ukrainian people. I'm David Muir. Good night.
Thanks for seeing me. I'm glad you scheduled some time.
Teledoc, the right care when you need it most.
Time to get planning for 2022.
Structure as proposed, it's going to have a tough time.
Oh, absolutely. This is not a tax proposal that's intended to get enacted into law. It's designed to energize his dispirited base. Joe Manchin said in December that he's not for a tax on unearned income. Kristen Sinema opposed the Build Back Better because of the taxes. So this is not serious legislating.
All right, panel. Thanks so much.
This too shall pass. You know, there is an opportunity for all of this to move forward. And it's a reminder of how blessed we are here in the United States, right? We're watching brothers and sisters in Ukraine deal with real situations, life or death. Right. And we're talking about a moment at the Oscars, and it's one of those things that reminds us that there's nothing wrong with humility. I pray that Jada and Will get the healing that they seek.
And, you know, also to expand upon that, Chris Rock, his comedy tour is kicking off tomorrow in Boston. I don't know. We'll see. Interesting.
And his tickets
talk
are like
about
10
it?
times.
Oh, I know. Of course, that always happens, right? People immediately rush out, and that's what they want to see. But yeah, I'm sure he'll maybe bring it up.
Wonder
tomorrow.
if he's going to
We'll
use
see.
some of that in his material.
Lots of material he has at this point. All right, everyone on the panel,
comedy should
thank you so
definitely
much.
slap,
We
though. That's
appreciate you doing it. On Balance with Leland Vittert is next. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, you guys.
Tonight, Russia is saying it will pull troops back from Ukraine's capital as peace talks offer faint glimmers of hope. But the violence continues. Ukraine saying at least 12 were killed when a Russian strike left a hole in a government building. That attack coming as both sides signaled progress from talks in Istanbul. Moscow saying it will drastically reduce its military operation near Kyiv. But a skeptical President Biden saying, quote, "We'll see." And the fears among Ukraine's negotiators of being poisoned. Also tonight, the FDA and CDC authorizing second COVID boosters for adults 50 and older as that Omicron subvariant now becomes dominant in the U.S. Tracking a potential multi-day outbreak of severe weather, Al Roker is here. The new reports more than 7 hours of former President Trump's phone logs during the Capitol riot are missing and just revealed when Jared Kushner will testify before the January 6th committee. Will Smith apologizing to Chris Rock for slapping him at the Oscars. The Academy Board set to meet, the consequences Smith could face, and wife Jada Pinkett Smith breaking her silence. And the historic law signed by President Biden today, named in honor of Emmett Till, that many say was long overdue.
This is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening. It may be too early for the world to hold its breath, but we start tonight with what could pass for a glimmer of optimism coming out of the war in Ukraine, specifically from around a negotiating table in Istanbul, where Russia announced it will drastically reduce military operations near Kyiv and Chernihiv to increase trust. Trust is in short supply, and as Russian missiles struck elsewhere, President Biden reacting to the Russian claim warily, saying, "We'll see." American military officials saying signs of movement may just be a repositioning of Russian forces after failing in their attempts to take Ukraine's seat of power. British military analysts say Ukrainian fighters were seeing some success with localized counterattacks to the northwest of Kyiv, but cautioning Russian forces still pose a significant threat to the capital. Also tonight, President Biden speaking to key allies, affirming all are committed to raising the costs on Vladimir Putin. Richard Engel starts us off tonight from eastern Ukraine.
The new talks between Russia and Ukraine began with deep mistrust. No handshake, but after 4 hours, the most significant progress so far. Russia's deputy defense minister announcing Russian troops would drastically reduce activity in central Ukraine around Kyiv and the city of Chernihiv. Ukrainian officials saying no foreign troops, all have to leave Ukraine. But that Ukraine would negotiate on the future status of Russian-backed separatist areas in Donbass, leave open the issue of Russian-held Crimea, and critically accept neutrality, not pursuing NATO membership, in exchange for international security guarantees. But is it real progress or a trap? Russia only agreed to scale back in areas where it was already suffering heavy losses. And in the east, Russia continues to bomb civilians indiscriminately in Mariupol and in Kharkiv, where today Andrei was recovering in the hallway of a hospital. Only there because Russian bombs blew out the hospital's windows. Andrei says he was escaping his home when suddenly I heard the whistle and then I lost consciousness. Badly injured in his leg, he says he somehow managed to get his wife and daughter into their car. But as they were leaving, Russian forces hit the moving car. His wife, Tetiana, 24 years old and studying to be a hairdresser, told him, "I'll be with you forever." They would be her final words. Andrei was recovered by Ukrainian troops. His injured daughter was taken by relatives. He has no idea where. His wife's remains are still in the car. Too dangerous to reach her.
I can't even imagine how that must feel.
I also can't express what's happening inside of me. It feels like a dream, a nightmare. But I can wake up, while my wife cannot. He only has one picture of her with him, but he can't bear to look at it.
Richard, the president today signaling a bit of skepticism. He says he's not going to read anything into the Russian statements until he sees what their actions are.
Well, I think here, Lester, there's even more skepticism than that, with many people believing that this is just a way for Russia to buy time so it can rearm its troops and move them from where they haven't been terribly effective around Kyiv and bring them out here to the east. And I can tell you, in this city, the Russian incoming fire has been more intense tonight than in previous days.
All right, Richard Engel, thank you. Let's go now to the side of those high-stakes talks. I'm joined by Keir Simmons from Istanbul. And Keir, I understand there were not many signs of trust around that table today.
That's right, Lester. There were many headlines made by the talks in the building behind me. One of them sparked by a startling warning from the Ukrainian foreign minister, telling Ukrainians in the room not to eat or drink or touch any surfaces for fear they could be contaminated with poison. And a Russian oligarch was invited by the Ukrainians. Most of the proposals came from the Ukrainians. Neutrality, a new long-term plan for Crimea, and a new strategic stability pact with Ukraine, where the West would defend Ukraine's safety. Of course, all of this, Lester, has to be agreed by President Putin. And tonight, the Russians are saying a meeting between President Putin and President Zelenskyy is a possibility, something they've ruled out until now. Lester?
Encouraging to know talks are underway. All right, Keir, thank you. As the war goes on, some of the first Ukrainian refugees have now made it to the U.S. after overcoming obstacles at the U.S. border that impact all asylum seekers. Antonia Hilton has that story from California.
This is now home for Sofia Inachuk and her 3 children, adjusting to a new life in California with relatives they had never met until a few weeks ago.
We all had lives, beautiful lives, full of happiness and friends.
It feels like everything's changed in the matter of a couple weeks.
Yes.
They fled Ukraine 3 days after the bombings began, heading for Mexico.
I have family and friends in USA.
But Sofia was turned away by Border Patrol twice.
How did that leave you feeling?
That moment I was really destroyed.
The U.S. border is still officially closed to asylum seekers because of Title 42, a public health policy put in place during the Trump administration that remains under President Biden, denying entry due to COVID. On her third attempt to enter, attorney Blaine Bookie, who was working with a Haitian child, saw Sophia and helped her get an exemption.
Every single day that passes, it becomes more and more absurd for the administration to claim that Title 42 has any basis whatsoever in public health.
For months, the Biden administration has been under pressure to end Title 42. Immigration advocates hope it will be lifted in early April, restoring the asylum process for all refugees.
What I'm very worried about is all of the families just like Sophia's from Haiti, Cameroon, El Salvador, other countries that are languishing.
Officials expect an immediate uptick in refugees trying to enter. Many are waiting in shelters along the border, hoping to make an asylum claim as soon as the policy ends. Sophia is grateful she and her children are safe, but her heart is still in Ukraine.
I want them to stay safe, to stay alive. I feel sorry for all that guys that are dying, for all those mothers that will not see their sons anymore.
Antonia Hilton, NBC News, Alamo, California.
All right, let's turn now to the COVID threat. Today, the FDA authorized a second vaccine booster for older Americans, but many remain hesitant about getting the added protection, even as concern grows over a new variant. Ann Thompson with late details now.
Older Americans have another chance to roll up their sleeves. The FDA today greenlighting a second booster of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines for anyone 50 and older 4 months after their first booster.
Think of this fourth shot, the second booster, as really helping bring you back to those same levels that you had to protect against Omicron.
The FDA also approved a second booster for the immunocompromised, including transplant recipients, people undergoing cancer treatment, and those with chronic conditions like lupus or rheumatoid arthritis. The age range for that group, 12 and older for Pfizer, 18 and up for Moderna.
Is a second booster a sign of failure on the part of vaccines?
Not at all. The second booster is just a reminder that vaccines are incredible, but they naturally decrease over time.
While cases are declining in the U.S., the rate of decline has slowed. Today, the highly contagious BA.2 variant is the dominant strain, accounting for 55% of new cases, a 20% jump in 1 week. But so far, boosters have been a tough sell. Of the 217 million fully vaccinated Americans, fewer than half, just about 97 million, got the extra shot.
How much impact will this have on the spike if fewer than half got the first booster?
It won't have as much of an impact on the spike itself. What it will have an impact on is how many hospitalizations and unfortunate deaths we will have.
By boosting antibodies to reduce the severity of COVID. Ann Thompson, NBC News, New York.
The January 6th committee's investigation is coming to a head tonight on multiple fronts, with reports of a 7+ hour gap in President Trump's phone logs from that day, and 2 more of his former advisors face being held in contempt of Congress. With more on all that, here's Garrett Hake.
The January 6th committee taking aggressive new steps to secure cooperation from critical witnesses, fighting to enforce their subpoenas by voting to recommend holding 2 more top Trump aides in contempt of Congress.
It's very important for us not to let people just blow off the Congress of the United States.
Senior aides Dan Scavino and Peter Navarro have each claimed executive privilege over their conversations with then-President Trump.
They refuse to show up. You can't just say, I'm not even going to bother to come. If you believe you have a claim of privilege, you come.
Mr. Trump standing by his false claims about the election in a statement responding, Republicans must get tough and smart and not let them get away with the crime of the century. The DOJ has not taken any public action on a December contempt referral for Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, frustrating Democrats.
The Justice Department also has a similar responsibility to take this seriously, because this was an attempted coup.
Committee members now debating whether to request testimony from Ginny Thomas, wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, after her text messages urging Meadows to fight the election results became public last week. and seeking to fill in the 7 hours of blank space on White House call logs and diaries from the afternoon of January 6th, reported by the Washington Post today.
Overall, where is this investigation right now?
We're still in the investigative phase. We're still gathering evidence. We're still chasing leads. We're still asking for interviews.
On Thursday, the committee expects to land one of those key interviews. Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner scheduled to appear. Lester?
Garrett Hake on Capitol Hill. Thank you. We're watching for severe weather tonight. Tens of millions at risk of violent storms and tornadoes over the next couple of days. Al Roker's tracking it. What's the latest?
Well, right now, Lester, we are looking at a wide swath from Des Moines all the way down into Texas. Currently, 20 million people at risk. Strong winds, damaging hail. Tornadoes are possible as this makes its way. We're really concerned tomorrow. Damaging winds for 35 million people. Strong, long-track tornadoes. Hail as well. As this system pushes to the east tonight, we're looking for those storms ramping up from Texas to Missouri. Tomorrow, this destructive line from Chicago down to New Orleans, almost 900 miles. And then Thursday, scattered storms likely in the mid-Atlantic. In fact, we are looking for 21 million people at risk. Thursday, stretching from New York all the way down into the panhandle of Florida. We're talking anywhere from 3 to 4 inches of rain. Could be flash flooding, but the thing we're most concerned about, Lester, the strong winds and these nighttime tornadoes.
All right, Al, thanks for the update. In 60 seconds, Will Smith apologizes for that slap in the face at the Oscars, plus his wife Jada's new message. But will it be enough to end the firestorm?
I'd like
this move today.
The FDA and the CDC said that they're trying to do everything they can to protect the people who are most at risk of the serious consequences of COVID-19. That also, and the fact that there is this subvariant of Omicron that is spreading here in the United States, but has also been causing a lot of problems overseas. And so while the FDA today tried to stress that the vaccines are still working in the most important ways, they're keeping us out of the hospital and they're keeping vaccinated people from dying for the most part, there is some evidence that that protection starts to wane at about 4 months, especially for older people and immunocompromised people. And so they also cited some Israeli studies showing that a fourth booster was protecting people and boosting their immunity. So given that, and given this subvariant, the officials said, okay, we're going to authorize Moderna and Pfizer for a fourth booster. Separately, the CDC said today that for people who got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and had been boosted with that they might want to consider a booster that's of an mRNA vaccine, so Pfizer.
You've covered a lot of scandals and seen a lot of leaks in Washington. If Democrats on the January 6th committee had the goods on President Trump, why wouldn't they just leak those?
They might not have the goods yet. There are still people they want to hear from. There are records they have not yet got. They may go down a rabbit hole of assigning obstruction of Congress to some people who are not complying. So we're a long way from them having their report ready to go. I have a feeling that when it comes out, it's going to be a big splash.
It certainly will be, and certainly the media, a number of the channels today sort of breathlessly covered both this gap in the phone logs and then the Ginny Thomas's texts as well. Mr. Will, always good to see you, even if it's on a Tuesday rather than a Monday, and we'll see you next week.
I hope so. Look forward to it.
You will. Opening day is coming up. Thank you, sir. Stunning new video of large groups of migrants crossing the Rio Grande and illegal entering, this time in Eagle Pass, Texas. You can see they're walking over with no fear of the Border Patrol. Smaller groups also spotted at crossing points all along the river. The migrant crisis is raging on the southern border. And if it is a crisis now, pour some gasoline on it. It could get a lot worse. There are now fears of an even bigger
wildlife and their habitats. Go online or call in the next 5
Well, there will soon be even more stores where you can buy some toys for the kids. We check out the new location for a longtime business up next.
Snow showers to greet us across eastern KELOland, as well as strong wind. Details tomorrow on KELOland This Morning.
husband, Prince Philip, who died last year at age 99. The Queen was escorted by her son, Prince Andrew, his first public appearance since a judge dismissed a sexual abuse lawsuit tied to Jeffrey Epstein, allegations he's denied. Up next, inside a city preparing for war amid fears that history will repeat itself.
Numbers move you, but some can stop you in your tracks.
60 last hour, 56 now, but then to the north, where we haven't had much sun at all, we have 30s and 40s. The wind coming in from the east in eastern parts of the area, but in western and central South Dakota, the wind becoming more northerly and very strong behind a cold front. And we'll see that northwesterly wind gradually making its way overnight into tomorrow morning into our area. So that'll help to eventually change the rainfall over to some snowfall. It's going to stay pretty windy during the day tomorrow, and the wind finally decides to slack off a little bit into tomorrow night. So here's Futurecast tonight, about an hour from now. Could see some of that rain already changing over to snow in a couple of spots, and then we'll have to watch for the possibility of some thunderstorms in southeastern portions of South Dakota and the surrounding area. And as we progress into the nighttime hours, there's that snow from central through northeastern South Dakota. We'll stop this about 1 o'clock in the morning. Still some showers and thunderstorms in the southeast, snow to the west. And then into Wednesday, we'll see still some scattered snow showers, some wind, temperatures in the 30s, not the greatest commutes in the morning. Then into the afternoon, into tomorrow about 5 o'clock, the snow will be continuing to move away. Windy, temperatures in the 30s, and then tomorrow night around 10, the snow should be pretty much done. Now, as far as actual precipitation, total precip is concerned, you know, northwest Iowa, southern Minnesota, some places over an inch. We'll get some decent amounts in central and northeastern South Dakota as well. And as far as the snowfall is concerned, better chances for several inches in northeastern portions of South Dakota. That's where you have that winter weather advisory out for tonight through tomorrow night. Here's a check of that 10-day forecast now. After tomorrow, things looking pretty quiet with warmer weather moving in, a slight chance of rain Friday. Then again next Monday. Otherwise, not too much going on after tomorrow in our 10-day forecast. Stay with us. Much more coming up after the break.
In very many areas of Ukraine, and they have not, pulled back from Ukraine, so the aggression is still there.
What more at this point do you believe the West, NATO can do to stop Vladimir Putin, to stop the Russian military, and especially to stop them from killing civilians?
First, we definitely have to help Ukraine with all the means that we can. Military aid, we can give them. We have given, as Estonia, a very small country, we have given a lot, over 200 million, which is for our 1.3 million people, a lot. But bigger countries can do more. Then second, we must help Ukrainians with humanitarian aid and trying to get the civilians out. But on the other hand, we also must isolate Putin in every possible way in all the international fora, because what he is doing is clearly committing war crimes.
We had on the NewsHour last night a respected analyst tell us that he believes that this war could be morphing into something like the Bosnian War, which went on for 3 years, left over 100,000 people dead. Do you think that that's a real possibility?
Well, if we look at the surveys that have been done in Ukraine, then majority of Ukrainians believe that they are winning this war. And the other question that was posed to them was that should the war be stopped should it be some territories should be left to Russia if they achieve peace? And again, majority said that no. So the President Zelenskyy is in a very difficult position because his people are thinking that they are winning this war, and the victory means that Russia pulls off completely from their territories. And until that time, they will fight. But at the same time, President Zelenskyy really wants to have peace because he sees his people being slaughtered and his cities being destroyed.
I want to ask you, Prime Minister, about Estonia. Obviously, you're a much smaller country than Ukraine. Does what's going on there make you much more worried about what Vladimir Putin could do to your country and aimed at your people, many of whom in your east are Russian speaking?
Well, first of all, actually, exactly 18 years ago today, we joined NATO, and that makes a huge difference. No NATO country has ever been attacked. We don't see any military threat, and we feel secure. At the same time, we also discuss in NATO to, boost our defense, because if we have such an aggressive neighbor and is clearly invading neighboring countries, then our deterrence should be boosted up as well, because in order to have peace, you have to prepare for war.
And how many, let me ask you about that. I mean, how many more troops do you think need to be stationed in Estonia? How much more weaponry? How much of that is or would be troops from other NATO countries?
We feel that we should have in the Baltics combat-ready division of NATO, of course, with the enablers, which means air defense and other capabilities. We are currently discussing at the NATO level, and the military is looking into that, because one is that we are ourselves investing a lot in our defense, almost 2.5% now, but also the other pillar is the collective defense of NATO. So we also have to spend this money wisely, which means that we have to cooperate more, procure some capabilities together that would be too expensive for any individual member state to do on their own.
Prime Minister, let me ask you about what President Biden said in the last few days, and that is that Vladimir Putin cannot, in his words, remain in power. Do you agree with him?
I think that Vladimir Putin has to be isolated politically on all the levels, because what we see in Ukraine, why there are more civilian casualties than there are military casualties, is because they are targeting the civilians. And this is a war crime. What I'm really worried about is that if some kind of agreement is made that Vladimir Putin is not, somehow liberated from all the responsibility, because if he is, then he will move and make additional moves later on. So we can't forget all the crimes that he has already committed in Ukraine.
What do you mean liberated from responsibility?
If the goal is to get a peace agreement, then what I mean is that this is not the end. We should not forget what he has already done to Ukrainian people. Because if we go back to business as usual with President Putin, then his appetite will only grow.
The sanctions that the West has imposed on Russia seem to be hitting the Russian people much harder than they are either Vladimir Putin or any of the people around him. Are they truly being effective?
We see that the sanctions work. Why else Putin is complaining about them and wants to, lift the sanctions or is talking about this. So definitely the sanctions hurt, and the sanctions should remain in place until, he is moving away from Ukraine, and also possibly paying for the war damages, the repairments for Ukraine. But if we compare the sufferings of the Ukrainian people, it's uncomparable what they are suffering to anything that is going on in Russia.
Final question, Prime Minister Kallas, and that is, as you watch the suffering of Ukrainian people day after day, as this war grinds on, how do you take that in as a human being? How do you take that in as a leader who is responsible for the Estonian people?
Yes, it's very difficult to watch, especially that we have had the same kind of faith. I mean, my mother was deported to Siberia when she was only 6 months old, together with my grandmother and great-grandmother in cattle wagons for 3 weeks. There are exactly the same crimes going on right now in Ukraine, and it's very, very difficult to watch. And what I've been advocating to other leaders of NATO is to give more military aid to Ukraine so that they can fight back, give you humanitarian aid. I mean, if we can do it for 1.3 million people, then bigger countries can do much, much more.
Prime Minister Kaja Kallas of Estonia, thank you very much. Thank you.
We journalists make so much more than them because of the way the American economy right now is structured, to where you had this sort of handshake agreement between Democrats and Republicans to sort of screw over the working class. You know, the decimation of unions, the decimation of trade in schools, of vocational training. It's really terrible. And we've seen this, you know, since the 70s, the stagnation of working class wages. You know, the college educated elites, they sort of took over government and then made the economy work really well for themselves and really poorly for everybody else.
Fair enough. The economy works well for the rich. That's sort of been throughout history. This plays into what you're saying. Top 10 metro areas, women earn more than men. Morgantown, West Virginia is an interesting one, but you'd think Naples, Florida, San Diego, New York, D.C., Washington State with big tech earners. Metro areas where women earn less than compared to men are where you don't have as educated of a population. Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Saginaw, Michigan, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, huge oil down there, Benton Harbor, Michigan, Decatur, Illinois, Odessa, Texas, where you've got a lot of oil, Beaumont, Port Arthur, Texas, again, big oil, Elkhart, Indiana, big.
I am Oz.
But when the curtain got pulled, the so-called Wizard of Oz was exposed for who he really was. A fraud. Just a weak-old man pretending to have all the power and all these answers, when really he was nothing special at all. Does that sound familiar to you? This week,
debacle of Iraq, that there isn't all that much we can do short, even when we invade and occupy a country, to change the culture of a place, to change the political reality on the ground, especially from the outside. And this is, I think for once, we have an administration that clearly sees both what it can and can't do and what levers of power it does and doesn't have over Vladimir Putin, those being the sanctions, arming the Ukrainians, making sure that they have as much of what they need to fight as the U.S. is willing to give them. But all my sources in the Biden administration before February 24th were saying, we're trying to make this war not happen, but we can't get inside Vladimir Putin's head and make him not do it. And ultimately, this still comes down to him and what's in his head and what he's willing to give up, when he's willing to stop this war. Unfortunately, he has now, with the propaganda apparatus that has been running at full steam for the last few months, he has created a real contingency inside Russia that wants blood, that wants this war, and it's going to be hard for him domestically to climb down from the Maximalist demands he's made.
It's shameful.
And
it's
again,
shameful.
There's not a ton that the U.S. can do about that.
That is a crying shame. I think most people would agree with that. Ukrainian member of Parliament Oleksandra Ustinova, thank you so much. Julia Ioffe, thank you. Really appreciate you both. Still ahead. It is deja vu all over again as conservatives recycle their anti-gay marriage push from 2004, this time targeting even just discussions of gender identity and sexual orientation in schools. Because if you don't talk about the LGBTQ community, they must not exist, right? See how that works? Magic. We'll be right back.
Tonight, the UK is seizing a nearly $50 million super yacht owned by a Russian businessman tied to Putin. The lavish blue vessel is one of the biggest in the world. It has a freshwater pool, penthouse apartment on the top deck, and it's actually been docked in East London for a specific reason, because the World Super Yacht Awards are happening there. David McKenzie is out front with a look at why authorities zeroed in on this yacht.
It's an extraordinary vessel, nearly 200 feet and costing almost $50 million US. It has an infinity wine cellar and a freshwater pool, and this is the kind of wealth, the luxury of those allegedly associated with Vladimir Putin. But this vessel, this super yacht, isn't going anywhere soon. So this yacht is only a few months old. It was delivered to London with much fanfare from a firm in the Netherlands. Earlier today, officers of the National Crime Agency were on board, effectively impounding the vessel. Now, these yachts have a very complicated ownership structure. Often it's registered in the Caribbean, they say, with a flag from Malta. And throughout the world, there is now a crackdown to target these boats, these yachts, allegedly linked to Vladimir Putin's oligarchs. I'm David from CNN. Are you able to say anything? No comment. No comment? No comment. There's still crew members on board, but they wouldn't say anything to us. The British government has been criticized in recent months for not being harsh enough on oligarchs allegedly linked to Vladimir Putin.
We tracked it down. We now know the connection. The ship won't be going anywhere for the time being, and that's because we take what Putin is doing in Ukraine incredibly serious. And people who have benefited from his regime cannot benefit from sailing around London and the UK in ships like this.
Whether it has any impact on the ongoing conflict really is up for debate, but it really is a powerful signal that this super yacht is now stuck at this wharf. Well, UK officials have yet to name this mysterious businessman, Aaron, but it does point to the complex nature of these transactions. Often the oligarchs have these shell companies, they have sophisticated financial instruments to try and hide their ownership, not just of yachts, but of jets, and of course of real estate, particularly here in London and of course in the US as well. There is pressure now for the US, the UK and European officials to try and squeeze these assets to try and have some kind of impact on those closest to Putin. Aaron?
All right, David, thank you very much. And as Western nations continue seizing yachts and inflicting other punishments on the Russian elite, President Biden and his European counterparts say they're determined to, quote, continue raising costs on Russia for its brutal attacks in Ukraine. Out front now, Ilya Matveyev, a longtime Kremlin watcher. And I really appreciate your time, Ilya, and really been following your analysis. So UK authorities seizing this super yacht, 192-foot yacht, owned by a Russian businessman. Just the latest example, of course, of what we've seen, right? Asset seizures in some jurisdictions of oligarchs. At least 8 yachts said to be owned by these individuals have been taken by the West. There are notably other places that haven't participated in this at all, like the UAE. The idea is that by taking the money and assets of the richest Russians, that Putin would then feel pressure. But Ilya, have you seen any evidence that that's working?
I don't really think that this approach is working, because the oligarchs who own those super yachts do not really have political power in Russia anymore. And we call them oligarchs by a force of habit. So they combined political and economic power in the 90s, but in the last 20 years, they were completely subordinated to the regime. They were subordinated to Putin personally, and they do not have any influence on his decisions. So you can take every yacht, you know, from these people, but they won't be able to do anything, even if they're angry at Putin, even if they do not agree with this, with his invasion, but they don't really have much power in the system.
So the sanctions obviously are, I mean, you know, whether they have influence or not is a separate issue from whether it's hurting them, right? It is hurting them, even though obviously they have money hidden in all sorts of places that no one will ever touch. But the sanctions are really hurting ordinary Russians as well. The Kremlin has acknowledged that people have resorted to panic buying. We've seen video of it, elderly Russians fighting in grocery stores over packs of sugar. Impossible to independently verify some of these videos, though, because there is no independent media in Russia. Right? There's just none. It's all been completely shut down. How bad is the situation for regular Russians right now?
It is pretty bad, and I think that sanctions are quite effective in, you know, affecting the lives of ordinary people. So at first, financial sanctions were the most effective, but now I think that logistics and logistical and maritime blockade of Russian trade is even more effective in terms of disrupting Russian economy, and Russian people do suffer from shortages of certain goods, certain essential goods, and from skyrocketing inflation. And it's not like they have a lot of spare cash. You know, Russia was already a poor country when the war began, so they don't have a lot of money to spare.
Right, right. I think that's such a crucial point that you make. And, you know, for so much of the country, incredibly poor. Incredibly poor in a way that many in the West would not fully recognize. Ilya, thank you so very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And next, new evidence of Russia's deadly assault in southern Ukraine. This video showing the moment a government building was struck by a missile. And we have details on the deadly toll, because it was deadly. Plus, Trump's phone logs from January 6th show a reported 7-hour gap. The logs don't include key calls that we actually factually know Trump had. So why? Why the big donut hole in there?
I brought in Ensure Max Protein with 30 grams of protein. Those who tried me felt more energy in just 2 weeks. Here, I'll take that.
Ensure Max Protein with 30 grams of protein, 1 gram of sugar, and nutrients to support immune health.
Faces get all the love. What about the body? New Dove Shower Collection is infused with hyaluronic and peptide serums to make your skin feel smoother.
And fraud and obstruction of the official proceedings, that is the joint session of Congress. It's not just an obligation of Congress to be looking into that for accountability. It's also the obligation of the Justice Department. And that means more than the people who broke into the building that day need to be under this kind of scrutiny and investigation by the Justice Department.
And is it your sense that justice is not doing what it should be doing right now?
I don't see any indication, to give you an example, that the former president's phone call with the Secretary of State of Georgia, in which he insisted the secretary find just the exact number of votes he needed to overtake Joe Biden. I think if anyone else were on that call and it was recorded in the way it was, they would be under investigation, and it should be no different because someone was a former president. If the rule of law applies to everyone equally, it needs to apply to everyone equally.
And do you hold the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, responsible?
Ultimately, the buck stops with the Attorney General. I think there's a desire to distance the Justice Department from any controversy and not embroil it in any political debate. And while that is laudable, we can't have at the same time a policy that effectively means if you're President of the United States, you're above the law. So I am concerned that in a desire to maintain a position above the fray, that credible allegations of illegality, serious allegations, may not be under investigation when they should be.
Two other quick questions, Congressman Schiff, about the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. It's been reported that the January 6th committee wants to and will seek an interview with Ginny Thomas in connection with her contacts with the White House, with Mark Meadows and others. Can you confirm that?
Anyone that has relevant information, anyone that is in contact with a White House chief of staff and urging support for this effort to overturn the election, if they've got pertinent information, then they ought to share that with the committee, and the committee is certainly interested in it. But we have not issued a formal opinion on Ginny Thomas, and so I'm going to defer to the committee until we do.
And finally, is it your view that Justice Thomas should recuse himself when it comes to any cases that have to do with January the 6th, as now the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is calling on him to do?
You know, I'm going to speak, since I'm a committee member, we're conducting this investigation at a higher level of generality. As a prosecutor, I avoided being involved in any case in which not only would there be a conflict, but even the appearance of impropriety. If you have a Supreme Court justice who is sitting on a case in which their spouse is in any way involved, and it gives the public the appearance of a conflict, they ought to go nowhere near that case. I do think this points out the need for there to be an explicit code of ethics for the Supreme Court, not one that applies to court of appeals judges or district judges that they can utilize at their discretion, but I think they ought to have a very clear code that they follow as well.
Congressman Adam Schiff, who is a member of the January 6th committee and chair of the House Intelligence Committee, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments today in a case that questions whether sweeping legal immunity for states trumps guarantees for America's military veterans. John Yang introduces us to a Texan who served his country and now finds himself in a legal battle for his old job. And a warning to our viewers, this piece discusses suicide.
I'm not alone in this battle.
Leroy Torres has a constant companion, a medical device that pumps concentrated oxygen into his damaged lungs.
It's something that I struggle with because I don't want to be hooked up to this machine. There was no reason that I had to, you know, and that's another battle that I deal in mentally. It's a mental battle, you know, but here lately, it's been the best thing that I can do to help me.
It's as much a badge of his service to his country as a decoration or a battle scar. As he fights through a migraine and what he calls brain fog, he describes a Southeast Texas boy's dream come true.
I had already made a decision at a young age that when I grew up, I wanted to join the Army and also be in state police.
In 2007, he swapped his state trooper's uniform for Army fatigues and deployed to Iraq as a second lieutenant in the reserves. On his first day on the U.S. base in Balat, he noticed something in the air.
When I arrived there, it was a Sunday afternoon, and we were stepping off the shuttle, and the question, what is that stench in the air? It smelled like burning rubber.
We have a burn pit down here.
It was the noxious fumes from burn pits that were used on U.S. military bases in Iraq and Afghanistan to dispose of everything from plastic water bottles and batteries to tires, electronic equipment, and paint cans. Jet fuel was sometimes used as an accelerant. Was there ever a time when you were on base that you didn't smell that smell or see the smoke?
All the time, every day. Smelt it every day.
Did it worry you?
Yes, a lot.
When Torres was honorably discharged in 2008, he was among the hundreds of thousands of service members who returned home with severe health problems believed linked to exposure to burn pits, leaving them with mounting medical bills and battles over veterans' benefits.
This is the war that followed us home, is what we've sort of labeled it.
Rosie Torres is Leroy's wife.
It's the debilitating conditions that I've seen just plague his body and him cry over things that we just didn't have answers for. And that's heart-wrenching.
And when he tried to return to his state police job, a right that federal law guarantees returning reservists and Guard members, Torres says his nightmare compounded. He says he asked for accommodations for his medical condition. Torres and the Texas Department of Public Safety disagree about what happened next, but Torres left the force in 2012.
You should be honored to have these veterans as your employees, right? Because, I mean, they went to defend our nation. Who's going to come back and want to feel as if they're disposable? Like, no state agency and no employer, I don't care if you're private, state, should get away with that, period.
I remember where this pit was at.
Torres wants to sue Texas, but the state argues it cannot be sued without its consent, a long-standing legal doctrine known as sovereign immunity. Today, an attorney for the Biden administration told the Supreme Court that blocking Torres' ability to sue jeopardizes national defense.
The Constitution was adopted in large part to stop states from undermining federal efforts to raise a military. This court has never imposed a state sovereignty-based limitation on the federal powers to raise and support armies or provide and maintain a navy.
But the Texas Solicitor General argued that's not what the writers of the Constitution meant.
There is no evidence that the founding generation saw the power to expose states to private lawsuits as inextricably intertwined with warfare, or that the states intended to be sued without their consent by giving Congress the power to raise an army.
This is not the kind of case that will break down along ideological lines, judging by...
Marcia Coyle is chief Washington correspondent for the National Law Journal.
The justices are going to be looking at the history, the structure, the text of the Constitution. What were the founders and framers worried about when they were drafting this? I thought at first that Mr. Torres's lawyer was getting the more skeptical questions. But then when Texas Solicitor General Judd Stone stood up, the justices weren't quite convinced by his arguments.
I met you guys about 3 years ago. Leroy, can you describe your experience?
Leroy and Rosie Torres are prominent advocates for veterans exposed to burn pits. In 2009, they created a nonprofit called Burn Pits 360 to press for VA benefits. But Torres almost didn't get to see this day in court. The mental anguish of losing his job and the physical pain of his medical ailments overwhelmed him.
I was struggling. I was struggling that night, and my plan was to end my life that night. And it was very, I didn't want to be a burden anymore. I felt like I was a burden to my wife.
His wife and service dog, named Hope, intervened just in time. Torres says he emerged from those dark days by finding new purpose.
This is an opportunity that I believe is a God-given opportunity that he's given us, because it's not just about me, but it'll be about thousands of others that will benefit from this, that they will have that right again.
Now he waits to hear if the justices of the Supreme Court will give him the chance for a state court to hear his suit.
Good girl.
An answer that's expected to come by this summer. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm John Yang in Robstown, Texas.
One of the most moving...
another state and we wouldn't know they have an abortion. Or if a woman has a positive pregnancy test, it must be reported to the state, and if she doesn't give birth, we're going to investigate her. Where does it stop if you're going to...
That's actually not a logical outgrowth of this law, because this law,
well, if you're trying
just
to
like
protect
the Texas
unborn,
law, has nothing to do with the woman.
Well, she can be sued too, but if you're trying to protect the unborn, that becomes the natural progression of this, right? Where does it stop? Who do you not sue?
You know, and that's the problem with SB 8 and its copycats, is that you really have to try out the law before you know whether it's legal or illegal.
SB 8's the Texas law where you can sue anybody inside of Texas. We talked to Josh Blackman, I know you know, conservative legal scholar down in Houston. When the Texas law came out, this is what he explained. Take a listen.
Imagine California enacts a law that lets private citizens sue gun stores for whatever violations of the law. That law cannot be stopped in court. Every gun store will be subject to 1,000 lawsuits. So this is a bottomless pit that we sort of start going down.
So how do conservatives deal with, say, California saying, if you facilitate the manufacture of a gun that's used in a crime in California, we can come back and sue you in any state for that?
So I think there's a difference between whether the law can be passed and whether the law can be challenged before it's effective, which, yes, the Texas abortion law can be passed, and no, it can't be challenged before it's effective. And then the question about whether it's legal or illegal. And I think that you could make an argument that the Texas law and that the Missouri law are illegal for any one of many reasons. Yeah. They just have to be tested out, just like that Texas law, that California law would have to be tested out.
You make a great point. Is this is all getting ready for the Roe v. Wade decision coming up here this summer before July 1st, in which case, whatever happens, it's going to be sort of this real earthquake in conservative legal circles and perhaps even on the progressive side as well. May, we always appreciate you coming on in the Reasoned View. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
That's the lowest price ever. And remember, my slippers come with...
If you struggle with CPAP, you should check out Inspire.
The full list of records, those are the questions that they're asking. We know for a fact, for instance, that there are calls not listed on these records that were turned over to the committee that did occur. We know, for instance, that he reached out and spoke to Mike McCarthy the leader of the House Republicans during that time. We know that he spoke to Tommy Tuberville. Senator Mike Lee. We know those calls existed, and they are not listed on here. So the question is, why is that? One of the possible answers, Aaron, comes from the former president himself. In a statement he provided to the Washington Post, he says he, to his knowledge, has never heard of the term burner phone. And so that is a possibility that might be one of the explanations here. We know for a fact from some more reporting on the White House that the president did use other aides' phones and personal cell phones that were not recorded by the White House system.
All right. Well, Evan, thank you very much. And I want to go now to our senior legal analyst, Laura Coates. So, Laura, on the back of Evan's reporting, the Select Committee, trying to figure out what happened in these 7 hours. So, did they just not get the full call logs, or was there literally a black hole that every phone call going on in those 7 hours was on a burner phone or an aide's phone? What do you think possibly happened here?
Well, we know he wasn't napping, and we also know that during that particular point in time, it was part of the most devastating experience for many members of Congress and all of the world watching as people descended onto the United States Capitol. So it's completely inconceivable that there were not telephone calls made. And of course, we know from other corroborating discussions from investigative journalists, those who have spoken to members of Congress, those who have volunteered the information about those moments, that they have spoken to him. So the question now is it a cover-up or an inadvertent failure to report and record the information? And if it's the latter, who is responsible for that? Joy, President Trump was not the person actually dictating the diary or the log. So was he dictating, or did somebody say to leave off information? That's part of where we have to follow the story. And finally, we are relying really in whole part on people to be able to volunteer the information or to come forward as witnesses responding to subpoenas to offer what the committee does not know. It does not bode well that all they have are these huge 7-hour gap and no real end in sight for people ensuring they're actually going to cooperate with the committee.
Right, and it's amazing, Lars. We know, obviously, it's funny, many years prior to when he was president, Trump, then Mr. Trump, would take phone calls always through the phone, through the switchboard, through his office. He was not a heavy user of his cell phone, except for when he wasn't in the office, and then he was. But we know that he didn't just take calls through the actual switchboard at the White House, right? Tons of calls came through cell phones and other people's phones. And in fact, we know that there were calls that Trump had during those 7 hours that they've spoken openly about that aren't on this call log. Evan referred to them. Here's a couple.
I was the first person to contact him when the riots was going on. He didn't see it.
I know I talked to him after we left off the floor.
He said a few things. They said, Mr. President, they've taken the vice president out. They want me to get off the phone. I got to go.
So these were calls with the president, and they were in that 7-hour window. So again, Laura, how do you interpret that?
And yet they're not reflected on the log. So the question is, who else may have been unwilling to come forward or admit that they in fact were there? That's part of the committee's investigative practice here, to understand what led up to and all around it. You know what? They're actually fighting with one hand tied behind their back. That hand could be released, of course, by the Department of Justice, who has much more of an opportunity to be able to have the investigative authority to figure out who in fact were those people, through call logs, through other corroborative information, and ways in which to dictate and determine who it actually was. But this is part of why this has to be this symbiotic relationship, Aaron, and also why we're waiting for those public hearings to come out later this year.
All right, thank you very much, Laura. And next, Russia and the U.S. may be in a dangerous face-off right now, the fear of an escalating war. But tonight, one bright, shining light of a different story.
Liberty a reality with Design and Buy project.
CPM. Elite place, but when people watch and see that there are no consequences, not even the ability to just say, next time, next year, you have forfeited the right to be able to introduce or stand on the platform of any kind. They can't even do that. We're going to start seeing people do this in other settings. That's what you get when you don't have standards that apply to everyone.
And I saw this today. A lot of very talented comics are nervous. They're nervous about getting up on stage. They've already had to deal with cancel culture, and now they have to worry about getting slapped in the face by someone who they may have offended or insulted in their act. It's an act. So I think this is more significant than people realize, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. What about if you're giving a lecture at a university and someone doesn't like it? What if someone at a presidential press conference decides they're not happy with what's happened? We're creating this action where actually, instead of immediately expelling him, instead of doing that, he was lauded, he was praised, he was allowed to be recognized in front of everyone, and now, even now, while we speak, there's still no actual consequence. How this plays out, I remember when the pie was being thrown at people at random places whenever prominent people showed up. What happens when we go from pie to actual fists?
I agree. And if you're throwing pies at Waters, make it a lemon meringue. Horace?
Be called, and you know what? Next year, the Oscars will have him on stage presenting the award for Best Actress like nothing happened.
But I mean, in a sense, though, I mean, Chris Rock's side of this story, right? He hasn't said anything yet. The idea, he's probably going to speak through his comedy routine because he is on tour right now. I'm assuming the tickets are already selling out, that he is going to have his say when it's his turn to do his routine. No.
Look, he can have his say about Will. He will say whatever he wants. Will is like, I am fair game. Stick knives and arrows at me. It's all good. Don't make more jokes about Jada. And really, part of the reason why this is a conversation is because Black women can be attacked in that way. Imagine him saying something like that about Selma Blair, right, who's going through MS. Imagine him saying, hey, Judi Dench, you're looking fat this year. Like, can you, I mean, like, the room reacted negatively to the Jada comment. The room would completely destroy him for attacking a fragile white woman in the same sort of way. And, you know, there's the lack of understanding of the primal notion of you insult my wife, my children, my mother, I'm going to be moved to do something about it. I'm not sure why that is so lost in this.
I think people understand that, but what do you make of the argument that he also did commit violence on national TV and that he wouldn't have struck potentially maybe a white comedian that way?
I mean, I can't do the hypotheticals, right? I don't, but I mean, like, I don't believe that he would not have struck a Jimmy Kimmel in the same way. But I also don't know that a white comedian would be repeatedly attacking Jada from the Oscar stage. Let's not forget, this is Chris Rock's second time attacking Jada.
Well, we got to go. We got to go. Teray,
actress.
I appreciate you, brother. And listen, I am for both of them healing and winning. So that is my verdict. Teray, thank you very much. And that is tonight's Readout. On with Chris Hayes starts now.
For decades and decades, the Human Rights Campaign has been by far the most powerful gay rights lobby in Washington. You may have just heard of them recently, but they've been around for over 40 years. And for most of that time, HRC's central goal, and they said it many times, was winning the right of gay people to get legally married. And then in the summer of 2015, they finally succeeded. They reached their goal. The Supreme Court issued a decision in a case called Oberfeld versus Hodges. And overnight, all 50 states were required by law to recognize same-sex marriage. So for the Human Rights Campaign, this should have been a moment of unbridled celebration, a dream come true. But it wasn't. It was a crisis. And if you don't understand why it was a crisis, then you don't live in Washington surrounded by nonprofits. So by this point, the Human Rights Campaign had evolved from a scrappy little lobby into a prominent arm of the Democratic Party. It had a huge annual budget, an enormous headquarters building right on 17th Street downtown. So the Human Rights Campaign may have outlived its reason for existing. On the other hand, it couldn't just disappear. There was a party to help, but there was a fundraising problem. Why would you give money to a group whose purpose has become obsolete? That was the dilemma. And they're not the first. The Women's Christian Temperance Union faced the same problem after Prohibition passed in 1919. And you don't hear a lot about the Women's Christian Temperance Union anymore. HRC desperately hoped to avoid that fate. And, here's the point of the story, amazingly, through clever rebranding, they did avoid that fate. So in 2014, just before gay marriage became law, HRC's annual budget was about $57 million. That's a lot. Listen to this. By 2021, last year, that same budget had expanded to $65 million. In other words, 7 years after reaching its stated goal, its reason for existing, the Human Rights Campaign was raising even more money, a lot more money.
Shaken this close-knit community is. This young woman, she lived all over the world. She moved here, wanted to start a life here, and ended up getting kidnapped from this Walmart parking lot behind me. Drive around Fernley, Nevada, and you'll see the billboards and the flyers. They're everywhere. This small, normally quiet city is on edge ever since 18-year-old Naomi Arion was kidnapped from a Walmart parking lot on March 12th. In surveillance video, you see the suspect seeming to stalk the parking lot where Naomi was parked and waiting for a shuttle to take her to work. That's the moment her family's world changed forever.
And then when he turns and he squares his shoulders and he's staring at her car. Oh, I got such chills. It was like that moment when a lion spots its prey and is about to pounce.
Knowing Naomi the way you know her better than anyone, is she the type that would fight, or is she the type that would?
Naomi is like a deer in the headlights. She freezes.
Before moving to Nevada last year, Naomi lived all over the world. Her dad is a U.S. diplomat, and Naomi grew up in Russia, Germany, and South Africa, always heavily guarded on an American diplomatic compound. So Naomi was used to sort of a, would you say, like a sheltered life in some ways, or a secure life?
We are very protected. We live in a very secure compound with 12-foot walls with razor wire that's electrified on top. We have armed guard at our gate. Everybody has to show ID in order to get in. All of our windows and doors have, you know, steel bars.
In August, Naomi left that world for Fernley, just outside Reno, Nevada, to live with her brother.
Things were going great. She has her own car, has a job. She was saving up money in order to get her own place.
This is the area where Naomi was parked and waiting on her work shuttle. It's dark, not a lot of people around. Detectives say she was last on social media at 5:23 a.m., and it was just about 1 minute later that the suspect approached her. Her car was found nearby in an industrial area, and on Friday, 13 days after she was abducted, police arrested 41-year-old Troy Driver. He's behind bars and charged with kidnapping. But what's so disturbing is, despite the arrest, investigators still haven't found Naomi. And Naomi's family says he doesn't appear to be cooperating with police. We're on our way to where Troy Driver's truck was found. It's about 30 minutes or so from the Walmart, and we've learned he has quite a disturbing past. According to newspaper records, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison in California in the late 90s for accessory to murder. He was accused of actually hiding a body inside a car. Ma'am? Excuse me, ma'am? A woman at the house where Driver's truck was found went inside when she spotted us. It seems he may have the information you need.
Probably. Probably. And I understand that he has a family. He has a daughter. And I can't imagine that a man who is a father to a little girl could go out there and take someone else's little girl away from them. I just don't understand. I want him to try and put himself into our shoes and how we feel. How would he feel if this happened to his little girl? He needs to give up her location and give her back to us.
And it's just so difficult to imagine what Naomi's family, what her parents are going through right now. On top of all of this, Ruta Bay, they also adopted 3 Ukrainian little boys, with special needs. Those boys were living with them at the U.S. diplomatic compound in South Africa. And you can only imagine when those parents got the call that their daughter was kidnapped here in Nevada, not only did they have to pack up and travel halfway around the world here and deal with this, they have those boys with them now, the entire family just hoping that Naomi is found soon and found alive.
This is an unbelievable story, and you can just, that pain of the family is palpable. We know that Naomi had a date the night before she went missing. Has anything been said about that person?
Yeah, the family does confirm that she had a date, but they say that the FBI has looked into that person and that person is not a suspect right now. Also, she had filed a sexual harassment complaint at the place where she works, the factory where she works several months ago. That has also been looked into by the FBI, the person who was involved, and that person has also been cleared.
So many facets to this story. And what do we...
How big this really...
The way of return fire from the Russians. I mean, what is blaringly clear is that the Ukrainian forces have been able to make a significant push toward the town of Kherson, which is actually occupied. It's the only major city occupied by the Russians in Ukraine. So it's clear the Ukrainians are making progress, but having said that, this evening we heard some massive bombardments on the outside of this city. So the preferred tool of the Russians, it appears, is rather than engaging with ground forces, where they have not performed well under against the smaller Ukrainian army, but it's with things like long-range missiles and artillery that they continue to use with deadly effect.
Yeah. Caitlin, do President Biden and the administration share the same skepticism as President Zelensky when it comes to what Moscow is claiming in terms of troop movements?
Absolutely. They're not even just really tiptoeing around it saying, well, maybe they are doing this, let's wait and see. They are being very blunt, Anderson, in their skepticism of what Russia's actually doing here. And they say, yeah, maybe they're moving around a few small forces, which is what the Pentagon acknowledged today, but they think really that just amounts to a repositioning, not a real withdrawal on their part. And instead, Anderson, they're actually warning that Russia could be preparing to conduct another major offensive. So they're telling people to be prepared for that, and saying that just because Putin couldn't take Kyiv when he wanted to doesn't mean that there is no threat to Kyiv any longer. And they're offering that warning pretty bluntly tonight.
Ben, there was also a strike today on an administrative building in Mykolaiv that killed at least 12 people. Obviously, if Moscow is planning on occupying a town like Mykolaiv, striking the administrative building is going to make any kind of actual administration, if they are actually planning on administrating services in a city, much more difficult.
I don't think, Anderson, their concern is administering or governing these cities. What we've seen in the cities they've taken over is that they've imposed what seems like an almost Stalinist regime of rounding up journalists and any others who might pose any problems. And therefore, yes, the strike on the administrative building was a shock, because I haven't seen anything like that since shock and awe in Baghdad back in 2003. A massive hole in this building. The strike took place at 8:45 this morning local time. As you said, 12 people dead, 33 people wounded. The governor himself was supposed to be in the office, but he slept late, and so he wasn't there. But what we did see, and it's important to keep in mind where this building is located. It's the middle of the city. It's about a little over a mile from where we are right here. And many of the buildings around the administrative headquarters for the province were shattered. And so this is a city that people were beginning to think, with the gradual pushing back of Russian forces, that life was going to somehow settle down. The strike today showed them that may not be the case. Anderson?
Yeah. And it certainly shows the true nature of the Russian agenda. Caitlin, is there anyone inside of the administration who thinks the president's comments over the weekend that Putin couldn't remain in power is behind some of these new claims by the Kremlin?
Not really. They've kind of just tried to move past that after the president came out yesterday and clarified what he meant, saying that he wasn't stating any kind of new policy, saying instead he was just speaking his own personal feelings about what he thinks should be the case in Russia and that he was appealing to the Russian people. They don't think this has really affected Putin's calculus at all. And it's been interesting because they have at times talked about this notion of, and this challenge really, of confronting Putin without provoking him. And that was something that a lot of Russia experts raised about that question. But today, you know, they're really focused on what Russia is actually doing when it comes to these forces on the ground. And so the president spoke to the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom about this. President Biden told us that he reached this consensus really with them where they just want to wait and see what it is that Russia does. But in the meantime, they are keeping the sanctions in place. They are going to continue sending that military assistance to Ukraine. And that's a notable statement given, of course, right after President Biden spoke with those leaders, the French president was getting on the phone with President Putin. And so that's kind of been this wheel of how they are dealing with him, how they are talking to him and waiting to see what it is he actually does. But they don't seem to be prepared to change any of the posture when it comes to sanctions or sending equipment to Ukraine until something changes.
Caitlin Collins, Ben Wiedemann, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Coming up next, what today's mixed messages about Kyiv mean to a mom sheltering with 3 kids while her husband is fighting in that city. We'll check in with Elena Ganes, who we've been talking to throughout this invasion. Later, it makes Richard Nixon's infamous 18-minute gap in the Watergate tapes look like a blip. What a reported 7-hour and 37-minute gap in the White House phone logs on the day of the insurrection could possibly mean, especially when we know the former president was taking calls. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein join us tonight.
Road trip. If you book with Priceline, you'll save more, so you can bro more.
Bro. 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 Bro.
Good thing you saved on the trip. Priceline. Every trip is a...
And financing for 72 months on
to make sure underserved communities had health access to the health care that they need. And they have been essential in providing access to reproductive care and the freedom that people deserve in our state. Each are going on a new journey, but they leave a legacy of unrelenting pursuit of reproductive freedom. I say thank you to Mona and to Lillian, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Frankel.
Supplies are limited. Call now.
But you also hand your kids over to. Woohoo, not creepy. Quote, our goal as a company is for this law to be repealed by the legislature or struck down in the courts. So let's just think about this for a minute. Here you have a law passed in a democratically elected state legislature, signed by a democratically elected governor, supported by the majority of Florida voters, but it must be struck down because the oligarchs at the mouse company don't like it.
Reference back to Watergate, you know, about 50 years ago, a very infamous cover-up. This definitely, you know, has overtones of that again, because there's just really no explanation for this 7 hours. And if I was to go even further, you know, we've talked a lot in the committee about the 187 minutes, the 3+ hours that this was happening on national TV, that the president sat and watched this. We understand that he was watching what was happening at the Capitol. And, you know, as someone who's a naval officer, it's how I spent my career before coming to Congress, you know, what this brings to me is this idea of dereliction of duty. The president has a duty to take care that the laws of the nation are enforced and carried out. And if I think about it, you know, any officer in the military who the president commissions, officers in the military, you know, any officer in the military who sat and watched something like this for 3 hours and took no action, they'd be court-martialed. So, I mean, in my mind, President Trump it's a dereliction of duty. And if he was a military officer, he'd be facing a court-martial for that dereliction of duty under these circumstances. So there's so many questions that the committee is trying to answer, and that's why we need to hear from people like Dan Scavino, who we referred contempt charges on because he's decided he's above the law and he doesn't want to come talk to Congress under subpoena.
Yeah, some context for Scavino that seems important. Obviously, he's, I think he was at one point the president's caddy. He then became his social media manager. Obviously, being a social media manager involves, you know, having access to the account of the president and some close proximity of the phone you're using or his phone. there's also a subpoena for his phone records that he's been fighting very hard. The legal mystery of this anonymous objection to it began on January 5th this year when a person only identified as the plaintiff filed a lawsuit contesting a subpoena issued to Verizon by the Special Congressional Committee. U.S. District Chief Judge Beryl Howell said no, and Scavino refiled the complaint under his name in the same case on Friday. So the committee, not having access to an actual call log, has gone about subpoenaing phone records. Dan Scavino is fighting that. How important is that aspect of the investigation?
Well, all of these pieces, it's really important that we have them to put them together to determine what was the web of communications that happened that day. So it's not just Dan Scavino, but there's others who had, we think, and we understand we testimony. You know, we've had 800 witnesses come talk to us. We know about other people who talked to the president that day, the people who talked to his chief of staff, Mark Meadows. And, you know, although those people have objected to coming before the committee to this point, we have a lot of information about the calls and communications that happened that day. And so this is yet another piece of painting that picture of everything that went on, who he talked to, and ultimately, what is he covering up?
In the vote to refer contempt to the Department of Justice for these two witnesses, one of them being Dan Scavino last night, you said, Merrick Garland, Attorney General Merrick Garland, do your job. It was quite a striking moment. What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, this is not the first time the committee's come together that we referred contempt charges. It's been over 3 months since we referred those charges relative to Mark Meadows. And, you know, there is a constitutional duty to appear before a subpoena in Congress. And, you know, Mr. Meadows has, you know, claimed executive privilege and all of these other things, as has Dan Scavino and others. And the truth is there's a process for that. They have to come before the committee. They have to legitimately lay out those items that they believe are covered by privilege. And the committee will consider those things one by one. But just not appearing and just essentially rejecting or ignoring a subpoena from Congress is against the law. That's why we referred contempt charges. The Department of Justice did move for Bannon, but they've been intransigent. They haven't moved yet, haven't done anything for Bannon, and there's two new important witnesses here. And, you know, it wasn't just me, others on the committee said, you know, the Department of Justice needs to move swiftly and do their job so that, you know, we can do our job and analyze this information as part of our investigation.
All right, Congresswoman Elaine Lurie, who sits on that January 6th subcommittee, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, my interview with Senator Elizabeth Warren on her letter to the Supreme Court.
About when I was in school, we just did schoolwork. You know, we did things like math and science and reading. I don't even know how this would become fodder for a second grade classroom. And so the fact that they're going to this lengths to try to torpedo legislation that I think 90% of parents probably view as just common sense, it really makes you wonder, you know, about what's motivating this decision making.
It really does. And just to be clear, final question. I read the bill. It doesn't say anything about gay marriage, does it? Is it not an anti-gay marriage bill?
Tucker, the word gay is not in the legislation.
Right,
so they say it's banning a word that literally isn't even in the legislation. It's not even like they're misrepresenting the way the word's used. It's not even used in the bill. It's a fake narrative. It's a lie. But it's a lie because they have to lie, because if they admitted what they were really for, sexualizing kindergartners and first graders, they know that would not fly with the public.
Man, you got a lot of huevos to do this, and I appreciate it, and I hope all the other cowards sitting in governor's offices around the country watch this. Ron DeSantis, thank you.
Thank you.
So Adam Kinzinger, as we've told you many times, is deeply upset about democracy, which the big orange man who last occupied the White House destroyed. Very upset about that. What you may not have known is that not so long ago, he was begging Donald Trump for a job. Really? Quite a story. Adam Kinzinger, we've got that update. Also, talking about Ukraine is now about proving your own virtue. You may have noticed, no offense to the people of Ukraine, it's about our reaction to the war in Ukraine. And we've got a whole segment on that coming up.
Center of gravity target is Kyiv. So whether or not he starts to focus on Donbass because he's losing on the battlefield is another thing to consider. But let's make no mistake about this. He is all about, again, taking over Ukraine.
And when the Kremlin makes these announcements, right, who are they talking to? What is the aim?
Well, it's a good point in your question, because the aim is there's multiple audiences here. First and foremost, it's to satisfy, the Russian people, because right now this is really a war an invasion rather, that's really going poorly, and so they're bogged down. And so there's a narrative here to placate certainly the attitudes of the Russian people as they become more and more informed on what's really going on in Ukraine. Secondly, it's obviously to Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, but every time that Putin tries to, scale and take over the narrative, it just stiffens the resolve of President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. Third, it's to the West. And the West being obviously the United States, leading NATO, to include the European Union, the G7. And the fourth audience, frankly, is the rest of the free world that really is laser focused on this conflict.
And so the Pentagon says it's a repositioning, not a withdrawal. But this does come after these negotiations. If you're putting on your optimist hat, is it possible that this could be a concession by Russia?
Yeah, I'm not ready to put on my optimist hat right now. Again, I look at capabilities. I try not to really read intents, or intentions rather. I look at capabilities. The Russians are still shelling Kyiv with long range and medium range artillery. They're still pummeling, Mariupol down there in the south. Kharkiv is still under, attack. All the while, the Ukrainians are fighting back. They're on the offense. As was mentioned earlier, is that that town Irpin just to the west of Kyiv is opened up because the counterattacks by the Ukrainians. So I don't put anything in terms of narratives. I don't put anything in terms of deception or miscommunications at all. I look at the facts on the ground. The facts are telling me that the Russians are dug in. Their still objective is to topple Zelensky and Ukraine. So I'm still not buying it.
Actions speak louder than words, right? Zelensky, though, does seem to be willing to make a concession, remaining neutral. Would he say that negotiators were not getting anywhere with Russia?
Well, I wouldn't use the concession word with President Zelensky. I think what he's put on the table is he wants his country to remain sovereign, wants to protect the sovereign territory, were his words, which means he wants all Russian forces out of Ukraine. That includes the Donbass region and so forth. Secondly, he is looking for security guarantees that not only from the West, but other partners that could play in those security guarantees, maybe China, maybe Israel and so forth. So no, he's not making concessions because actually he's in a position of strength right now. He doesn't have the mass that the Russian military has. By the way, 75%, according to General Todd Walters, the commander of the United States European Command, says it's committed to this conflict. 75%, that's extraordinary. But Zelensky still, I believe, holds some cards here. Therefore, he is not in a position to appease, I believe, and we need to continue to make sure that he's in a position to succeed and frankly win.
All right, Lieutenant General Newton, thank you. Appreciate your time tonight.
Good night.
Still to come, watching the Academy's next move and if Will Smith could be forced to return his Oscar. New details on the organization's upcoming decision. That's next on Prime. Plus, spring break chaos coming up. The reason for these long lines at one airport forcing some people to abandon their rental cars.
Just sold my car with Car Gurus.
Yeah, you did.
White House records, which included, quote, call and visitor logs, handwritten notes, and other files previously kept by senior Trump aides like Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, he was ruling on turning over a body of evidence that very well could have included his wife's plotting. She was corresponding with major players in the White House like Mark Meadows. And he, in his official capacity, is saying that none of that material should be given to the committee investigating the insurrection. Pretty clear conflict. Result, a handful of House Democrats, including Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, have called for Justice Thomas to resign or be impeached. Today, a group of 22 Democrats, led by Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts and Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal of Washington, sent a letter to Thomas and Chief Justice John Roberts demanding Thomas explain his failure to recuse himself in previous cases and that he, quote, promptly recuse himself from any future Supreme Court cases involving efforts to overturn the 2020 election or the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts joins me now. Senator, I want to start with an argument that I've seen Republicans make and that others have made